Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Institute for Cybersecurity Tech Frontiers, the podcast where we dive into ideas shaping the future of computing, AI, and cybersecurity, straight from the minds of researchers and innovators. I'm your host, James Benson, and with me today is Ariel Benjamin.
Hello.
Today's episode is all about IoT cybersecurity and forensics, and we're joined by Oren Upton, a research scientist and lab director of the IoT Cybersecurity and Forensics Lab. He's got a long work history with the United States Air Force with digital forensics. So let's get into it. Welcome, Oren. How are you?
Great. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, why don't we start with your background? Tell us about your history in IoT cybersecurity.
Yeah. So I started in computer stuff, basically with the Air Force. I spent 24 years in the Air Force. And so that started off with big mainframes, back in the late 80s. and then progressed to doing digital forensics. So started off doing computers, then some intelligence analysis with the Air Force. And then I changed to be a special agent with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. And they trained me in computer intrusion investigations and digital forensics for the Air Force. And so doing those sorts of investigations really that was late 90s when that was still kind of a new thing. And so we learned how to do that then. And then I did that some more through, the rest of my Air Force career. After I retired from the Air Force, I did some work with a couple of companies, one in the Washington, D.C. area where we were doing some kind of interesting advanced predictive data analytics. And then I moved back here to San Antonio, which I'd had a couple of assignments during my military career here. So San Antonio seemed like home. And once I was back here, I worked for Booz Allen Hamilton, helping build the training material for Air Force cyber protection teams. And then concurrently with that, I started teaching here at UTSA, teaching as an adjunct, teaching digital forensics courses. So, did that for about 5 years. And then about 6 years ago, I started teaching. I came on full time as a research scientist here at UTSA. And so I've been running the research lab that I've been working on. And it started off with like 4 students, but I've grown it to about 25 students per semester. So
wonderful. And why is IoT forensics and cybersecurity important right now?
So one thing about IoT is that it's a very interesting field because it's growing so rapidly. If you look at regular IT infrastructure and look at how many IT devices are connected to the internet, in 2010, it was about 8 billion. Now it's about 10 billion. So it's grown, but not dramatically. At the same time, in 2010, there was less than 1 billion IoT devices connected. And that doubled 2 years later, almost doubled 2 years after that. And it's been roughly doubling. So you've got this curve
Moore's
growing
Law
up.
Right there. Yeah.
And so in 2024, there was 24 billion estimated. Nobody knows the exact number, but estimated 24 billion IoT devices connected to the internet. And then last year it grew to 30 billion. So that's 6 billion in 1 year.
That's a lot.
This is rapidly growing. I've seen various studies where people kind of look at these IoT devices and, how many of them have major vulnerabilities. And it's between 60 and 75% of them have either critical or major vulnerabilities. So that means we're adding about 8 million devices a day, and about 5 million of those have major vulnerabilities. So yesterday, we added 5 million more devices with major vulnerabilities. Today, we'll add 5 million more. Tomorrow, we'll add 5 million more. So we're literally stacking up vulnerabilities on the internet with IoT. And so I think this is an important problem that needs to get some looked at.
Absolutely.
So it's a very interesting research area to be working in.
Have you found any interesting vulnerabilities that you're surprised?
Just the sheer number of them per device. And I think that's one reason that so many of these devices are vulnerable is if you're a manufacturer of IoT devices, you almost have an incentive to not pay attention, a financial incentive to not pay attention to the security, because if you have competitors, if you're trying to produce your device and you wait 2 or 3 months of doing additional security testing, and you give that 2 months to your competitors to have, the market share, you're just losing money for 2 months. And so they literally have a negative economic incentive to focus, spend extra time on the security of these devices. And if that's the case, then of course, we're going to continue to produce lots and lots of devices that are, we have to change the economic structure to be able to change whether we can come up with all the technical solutions for how to make these devices more secure, but if there's not an incentive for it to be implemented, then it probably won't be in most cases. And so we really got to do something different. I wrote a paper during my PhD courses on that, the economics of IoT. And so I think that, there are some ways that we can focus on this, but it's a huge problem. And that's why we focus on it in my lab.
Since your paper, do you think that there's any companies that have actually started to focus on making sure their security is good?
Actually, I think there's a couple of medical IoT manufacturers.
That's
they
important.
understand how critical it is. And so currently we're trying to do some vulnerability. I have one student that's working on her master's thesis in medical IoT vulnerability analysis. And so we've been trying to get into a Medtronic insulin pump, and that's been kind of a tough problem. And I'm glad that it's a tough problem.
That's good.
I think we'll still figure out a problem, but there are some devices in medical IoT, for example. There's a device called a Contech 8000. It's a patient monitor. It's kind of the device that beeps next to your bed when you're in a hospital, right? And heart rate and blood pressure, that sort of stuff. They had not only major vulnerabilities, but literally just a back door that connected back to China, and and anybody, once they knew that it was there, could get in and do anything they wanted to that device.
Wow!
And so CISA published, a major report on it, but that's an example of medical IoT being and so that was a surprise.
Yeah, definitely. So you mentioned briefly about your research lab. Tell us about that. How many students are in there? What would you do to get into that lab?
Yeah, so I have one PhD student and 6 master's degree students, and then I think a lot of research labs in other fields. I think like if you were doing medical research, you pretty much have to already be working on a master's degree to be able to work in that level of research, because you just have to get that bachelor's degree out of the way. But one thing I think that's interesting in the computer realm is so many students are literally in high school learning some of these things, especially here in San Antonio. We've got some cyber focused, STEM schools. And so students are graduating from high school, sometimes with professional certifications and stuff like that. And so I feel like it's a great opportunity, if I can find those sharp students that are interested, to give the undergraduate students that opportunity. And so I've got, of the 25 students working in my lab, most of them are undergraduates. And so, and I can even recruit, students as freshmen if they have that really strong background already, if they're graduating high school with 5 professional certifications.
Wow.
Yeah, I can, I could recruit somebody like that.
Yeah, you can work with that.
But other students, at the junior, senior year, but it's mostly word of mouth that students are kind of saying, getting interested. And I get emails, from time to time, hey, I'm interested in, working in your lab or whatever. And so I'll talk to the students, and if they, the main problem I have is that once I'm kind of trying to supervise 25 students, it's
that's a juggling nightmare. Yeah.
But I don't have. And so I have some students that work in my lab in paid positions, where I have grants and funding for that. I have some students that they're not paid, but they're doing either an independent study or they're working on their master's thesis or something like that. And so they're getting credit, but they're not getting paid. And then I have some volunteers that work in my lab. And so some of these students, they do this kind of stuff just on their own on the side anyway. And so if I have a real project for them to work on, they like working on those sorts of projects.
Yeah, it's important to find something that you're passionate about.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
What kind of because you mentioned like how you speak to the students after they've shown an interest in being able to join your lab. What kind of selection process does that look like for you? Like, do you have, if you have like 10 students who are all interested and they all come from a STEM school that focused on cybersecurity, what would give them the edge for them to join your lab?
Yeah, I am willing to work with students that just have. So one thing I want to see in somebody that wants to work in a research lab, I would say, of course, it's great if they have, some sort of, strong technical skills or certifications or, things like that. But really, I think the thing that's most important in a research lab for somebody that wants to work there, if I had to pick one thing, it's curiosity. If somebody's curious, like you ask a question, they're like, I've got to figure this one out. And then they go and dig. They're ready to go down that rabbit hole. That is the kind of person that I think is good for working in a research lab. Intelligence and, hard work, those are also very key. Students have to be able to do documentation well. That, of course, they don't have to do that right away, but they have to be able to quickly adapt to be able to do good documentation.
Would you say Python is the main language, or is it C because it's IoT?
I think both of those. It depends on the student. I don't have to have. I actually have students that are in my lab working from, in the computer engineering, and some of them have hardware skills. So we're literally, doing chip off and extracting data from, individual devices. I've got, computer science students that have good programming skills. I have students from the information systems and cybersecurity programs or data, cyber analytics or, things like that. So each of those students gets to do different things as long as it kind of fills a gap that I need in the lab. That's kind of what I'm looking for. And so, yeah.
So then topic wise, when a student's joining, are you picking like what they are going to look at and research, or is it like a joint effort that you do with the student to come up with topics?
Yeah. So for the paid research, I'm telling them what I need done, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because we have a contract and it's like, okay, you got to do that.
Yeah.
For the independent studies, as long as it's mutually interesting, we figured that out. And so this student that, wanted to do her master's thesis on medical IoT cybersecurity, right? That student, okay, that was a topic of interest to me and her, and she was a real self-starter. And so that was really good. And so we just, discussed it. The students that are volunteers in my lab, well, because they're a volunteer, it makes it easier for me to be flexible about it. And so that just means we just have to find something that's mutually interesting. So as long as we found something that's mutually interesting, then I'm good with that. And so one of the students that started off in my lab as a volunteer, then actually he came on, we found out that he, qualified for work study. And so he's working as a work study in my lab.
Oh, great.
And so with that, he actually has found what we think is an unpublished vulnerability in a smart lock. Wow. And so, but that was just something that he said, yeah, I'd like to look at this, smart. He and I discussed it, and then he dived into, that problem. We think that we found something we're now researching how to publish a CVE, right? So
that's great. Yeah. I mean, to have an undergrad student graduate with a, this is my CVE that I discovered and announced. That's incredible. That's great. Have you seen some of the students that have left your lab? Where do they end up working?
Yeah, actually, that's one thing that I've been really excited about is because I think an awful lot of undergraduates they come into these cyber related fields or computer related fields, and they say, okay, yeah, as soon as I graduate with my bachelor's, I'm going to go into industry. I'm going to go work for Google or Microsoft or whatever. That's their view, right? And one of the things that happens, I think often for the students that start working in research in my lab is they start saying, research is kind of cool. And so a lot of them have decided to go on to get their master's degree because they like that. Yeah. And many of them, some of my students have gone, or actually this semester, several of the students that working in my lab have gotten offers for positions at Sandia National Labs, at least a few of the students have gone on to work at NSA. We have a really good working relationship with NSA Texas. UTSA has a CRADA, Cooperative Research and Development Agreement with NSA.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have a good working relationship with NSA. And so some of the students have gone on to work there. I've got a student that just got a job offer to work with the Air Force. So a number of places. I've got really good working relationships with a bunch of, some of these government agencies. And so a lot of the students, are interested in working there. But lots of them go into the commercial world in various places as well. So
that's good. It's great that they can help the government and military out, but it's I would say it's nice to see them going into the devices to hopefully secure them before they get released.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So what's the first step when how would a student come in with a device and say, hey, I think there's something here. How do you discover that first vulnerability or how do you start probing the hardware?
So actually that is one of the things where it's been a good working relationship with both. So we have two research contracts right now with companies where with STTRs, which are kind of tech transfer. So the company gets a grant from the government to do research with a certain project, and then with that they are partnered with a university as well. And so these are phase 2, and so they're pretty well funded. And so one of the companies that we're working with is a company that's all the company does is do embedded device firmware vulnerability analysis. They have a whole automated system for finding vulnerabilities in these, but there's also an open source tool called EMBA. It's kind of standing for embedded analysis, but that EMBA tool, if we can get the firmware, we can. So you can do vulnerability analysis kind of in two ways. One, you can do kind of black box testing where you got the device and then you just scan it, Nmaps and the Burp Suite, whatever, the various tools for doing sort of analysis. But that's all black box testing. You don't know what's really going on inside the device. If you can pull that firmware out and unpack it and then do both static and dynamic analysis of the code, looking at the code and emulating it, you can do a much more in-depth analysis for vulnerabilities. And we find sometimes hundreds or thousands of vulnerabilities in any given device. And it's
wow.
That's why it's almost terrifying about the state of IoT.
That is, yeah.
Because I don't think we found ever, once we got the firmware, I don't think we've ever found a device that didn't have lots of vulnerabilities.
Now, I thought that most IoT devices had like some sort of encrypted firmware or scrambled or something. That's easy?
Packed.
They're packed.
And so EMBA, one of the first, it's got, I don't know, at least 88 modules. And the first several of them, dozen or so of them, that's all they do is automate the process for unpacking the firmware.
And then you see the code right there.
There can still be some, and oftentimes many of these devices have multiple partitions. Sometimes one of the partitions is encrypted. And so we may not see everything, but we're able to see a lot.
Okay.
And oftentimes we see plenty to get. Once it's unpacked, we almost always are able to see a fair amount of the firmware and get some insight into it. I will say some of the like Amazon devices that we've looked at, they had most of the firmware hidden, in encrypted partitions. But the user data was not, and so we, so we can do digital forensics on that, right?
Okay.
But it depends on the device. So far, we've been able to pretty much find vulnerabilities in every device that we were able to look at the firmware on.
Have you ever found a vulnerability, tried to patch it, and push it back to the device? Is that something that's possible?
So we haven't. And one thing, it's a really good point, because when EMBA, for example, says there's 2,000 vulnerabilities for device X, without doing extensive analysis of that, we don't know if they haven't. Just because it found a file that maybe had the vulnerability doesn't mean that they somewhere else in their firmware didn't mitigate that particular vulnerability. So just because we found lots of them doesn't mean that we know that every single one of those vulnerabilities is actually exploitable.
Mm-hmm.
I bet a bunch of them are, though. And the thing is that, then it's a matter of us, those are known CVEs, right?
Yeah.
And so as far as being able to try to patch them per se, we haven't tried to do that, but yeah, that would be another thing that could be done.
Okay. Do you think AI will, some of the latest news in AI was a model that just found
Mythos?
Mythos, exactly. It found a ton of vulnerabilities. Do you think a software like that or other AI models will help secure these devices before they get released or help find all of these vulnerabilities?
I think it'll help find them. I think the companies would have to do a ton of work
Mm-hmm.
to then secure them. And I think that's one of the biggest problems with IoT is that there's actually a financial incentive for the manufacturers to just get the device out to the market. Because it's growing so quickly, the more time they spend securing the device, it takes the time that gives their competitors more time on the market. And they're losing money. And so until you fix that incentive structure, I think that we're not going to have any fundamental improvements. I think that, and I'll give you an example of this. In 2016, that was the first large IoT botnet. Mm-hmm. It was called Mirai, and the Mirai botnet found these were like vulnerabilities where every single device that was marketed had the same password. For example.
Oh yeah.
And that type of thing, which is a super simple vulnerability to fix, but many companies were just throwing them out there because of the incentive structure that I was discussing. And so the Mirai botnet, in the first 12 hours that it was online, was able to compromise 200,000 IoT devices in 12 hours. And ultimately, the Mirai botnet grew to like 600,000 devices, and they could do these distributed DDoS attacks, and from 600,000 points, which is really hard to stop.
Yeah.
And so they were able to take down parts of Amazon for a while. There was a German telecom company that they pointed at, and they were able to take it down for several hours. There was a country in Africa that, I think major parts of their whole internet were down for part of a day. I mean, they could just point it at anything and take it down. Yeah. Ultimately, the Mirai, the person that created the Mirai botnet was caught, but he published the Mirai, software on GitHub, and so now there's all sorts of copycats, right?
Yeah.
But the point is just because people are getting hacked, or these IoT devices are getting hacked in the hundreds of thousands to billions per year, it hasn't stopped anybody from fixing it. Yeah. I mean, nobody's focused on fixing it. I say nobody. I'm sure that there's some people that take it more seriously than others. Like I said, Medtronic seems to have pretty tight and awareness that they need to make sure that their medical devices are not hackable. But I think that you have to change some other things fundamentally in the marketplace to be able to really solve the problem. And so the AI, I think, is going to help. We're working on some agentic AI to be able to go through. When we run EMBA, we can store that. We've got like 1,500 firmware samples that we've already run EMBA on. And so we can actually we're working on a grant today, actually. I'll be submitting it, one of the seed grants that UTSA has with SWIRI. And we're going to be trying to use agentic AI to look through all of that data. And then we want to kind of be trying to understand not just individual devices, but across lots of devices, using agentic AI to understand that, help us mine that data.
That's great. You mentioned DDoS attacks. Besides DDoS attacks, what else should consumers be worried about when they just go grab some device off the shelf and plug it in at home? And as a follow-up, how can a regular person help protect themselves from these types of things?
Yeah, I think that's a a major problem. And actually, I'm almost finished with my PhD. And so that's actually what my dissertation is going to be on.
All right. So everyone needs to go and read your dissertation.
But I think most people should realize that most of these devices have lots of vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
To the degree that they're technically able to do so, they should segment their IoT devices away from their IT devices. And so that's a helpful sort of thing to do, and set up firewalls and things like that. But the problem is that how many regular smart home IoT users are tech savvy enough to do all of those things? They're not cybersecurity experts.
Yeah.
They're just home users. And I think they assume that these devices, they wouldn't sell if it wasn't safe, right?
That's right.
Not true, but that's the assumption. And so the thing is that I think that we need to create a new device, another IoT device that I would call like a Shepard device, that is going to kind of, you'd put it on your network, it would auto discover all your IoT devices. It would automatically, create its own subnet for those devices, and it would be connected to the cloud, where like your antivirus, software that's constantly being updated, it would be watching for bad behavior specific to IoT devices, especially the ones that you have in your network. So that's what so my dissertation is going to be a design science. How do we design that?
That sounds like a great device. Yeah.
Yeah. I think if you had that device, then people that don't have cybersecurity experts could get that in, that a cybersecurity expert in a box that, is going to watch their IoT device.
Yeah. Monitor the packets, see where they go, what kind of data is being filtrated.
And if it looks like it's connected to a botnet, maybe we can cut that one off.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It's randomly connecting to this known attacking IP. Okay. All right, great. I think this has been a lot of information. Ariel, any questions?
No, it was a great talk, though. I really appreciated having you here so you could discuss your lab and all of the research you're doing.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I will say, I loved the work that I did in the Air Force. I liked my work that I did in industry. I love working in research. And it's so much fun working with students and working, kind of on all these sorts of projects. So I love what I'm doing. Yeah.
That's awesome.
And I'm sure the students appreciate you loving your work. It makes it easier for them.
The passion from the leaders is really important. So that's absolutely great. Well, thank you so much, Oren. It's been a pleasure. And any last words about how students can reach out to you if they're interested in joining your lab?
Yeah, I guess, so I don't know, my email address, oren.upton, oren.upton@utsa.edu. They can send me an email.
Okay, great.
Sounds good.
Super.
Thank you so much.